trajectory, saying, let's be specific, let's fit this into some kind of instructional sequence, into some pathway of learning in a way that really takes advantage of what we do that. And then, of course, we have to at some point get to actually moving primary. So these were our sort of broadest statements of the parameters we wanted to kind of put ourselves in. Having said that, I want to take a little, this is sort of a little oxbow here, and just talk about CCT in general, because this project is very much of a piece with my organization's history in general. So the Center for Children and Technology is part of the Education Development Center, but it was actually founded at Main Street College in 1981. And I love this picture. Actually, there's a problem with this picture, which is that there are no kids in the room. And there really should be kids. But I love this. I don't know if you can see it in the fact that it's a suspension bridge. They'll have a regular sort of classic building blocks and string. And it's the string building. And CCT was started at Bank Street by the president at the time because he, could sort of see on the horizon that technology was going to become a huge part of education. And he wanted to sort of get ahead of the ball in, ahead of the game in thinking about what it might mean for technology to play a meaningful role in the kinds of progressive constructive classrooms that Bank Street College was known for sustaining in its own school and in training teachers to create and support in the kinds of learning communities that Bank Street teachers had created. So, something I often think about as part of CCT and all of our work is successful technologies to me for teaching and learning are technologies that can fit in a classroom that looks like that, whether it's actually in early learning, in a setting like this, or middle school, or older kids, but that it's not about the technology sort of overwhelming the rest of the resources, but what can fit in and contribute to making teaching and learning a richer and deeper experience that has multiple kinds of material and visual experiences blended into it. So this is consistent with our approach to this project in particular, and for those of you who are familiar with other things that are going on in digital games work, and one reason we carved this out as well is because this is not sort of consistent with a lot of what's going on in digital games research. A lot of digital games we find out there are either really focused on putting kids outside of schools or contributing to creating sort of virtual curricula that live outside of normal curricula and typical kinds of teaching and learning situations. Or they're games, and there's a lot of this as well, that are really designed to kind of gamify existing instruction ideas. Right? So games that are designed to really embody an experience that the designers are hoping is really going to lead a kid through a very specific, theoretically driven learning experience. And so we were trying to do something a little different from that. But what we did see was important about games was this obvious fact that games are about play, right? And this is another place where I think a lot of digital games have kind of slipped over into, there's a cliche now, chocolate-covered broccoli, right? That there's some pretty straightforward drill kind of instruction that has, monsters and things around it in a digital game. And we wanted to really protect the play, to not have the game become that kind of game that smells like an educational game, and keep the instruction kind of out of it. And there's this fact with games that even kids that are not dedicated gamers know when you come into a digital game, one of the advantages and appeal, I think fundamental appeal of the digital game, any game when you first open it up, you have no idea what's going to be happening in that game. You don't know if the rules of gravity apply. You don't know what counts as, a normal creature populating this universe. You really have to set aside your preconceptions of what you expect when you walk into an environment, because in a digital game, all normal rules may be suspended, and you can design the rules the way you want to. And so that was sort of a quality of games that we really wanted to build on. So we put a few stakes in the ground at the beginning of the project, corresponding to these challenges we wanted to address. And the first was we wanted to focus on portable devices. And we committed to working with Nintendo devices. And decided we were going to design for the Nintendo DS, which then became the DSi. And one thing we were really wanting to address there was, and this again has to do with the idea of focusing on real schools and the sort of material conditions of real schools, was we wanted to say outside of, we wanted to find a way to get the gameplay time out of normal instructional time, which is already so limited for teachers, and also to acknowledge the realities of the limited hardware and internet access that many schools still have now, 6 years after we made this decision. Nintendo games don't need to be online and actually can communicate point to point, which we did not end up using for these games. We have used in other projects. And this allowed us to distribute the games to the kids and have them play them wherever. You didn't have to have teachers scheduling time in the computer lab 2 weeks, 2 weeks ahead of time, which is a common thing in schools, or any of those kinds of obstacles. We focused on middle grade science, and we focused on scientific misconceptions. I want to take a pause there and just acknowledge the quotes are there around scientific misconceptions, because we could spend the whole talk on that phrase and what's really to be unpacked there. This is a complex literature. I learned a lot about it in the early years of working on this project. And there are a lot of sort of theoretical nuances to how we talk about what exactly the prior knowledge is that kids bring into scientific teaching and learning, into learning science topics, and grappling with scientific concepts. The main thing we really wanted to focus on, DCT has always taken a strongly developmental approach to how we think about materials we create, and we wanted to focus on these middle grades kids. For one reason, this is a time many of the sort of classic scientific misconceptions really have to start to get addressed in the classroom. Typically, elementary science curriculum are largely focused on material experience, direct experience, right? You go outside, you observe the trees in a different season. You watch butterflies, although the butterfly thing drives me crazy, because what is happening inside that chrysalis? That's what I always wanted to know, and you never quite get in there. But the core set of practices and ideas that you want to do with elementary kids are about the sort of direct material experience. And middle school is the time that kids start to really be asked to begin to confront abstract systems and often multivariate systems, and to try to understand and sort of master conceptually abstract interactions that drive observable conditions. And those observable conditions are things that usually there are much simpler direct conclusions you can draw from observation that in fact are not accurate. And that's one very simple way to talk about prior knowledge and preconceptions kids may have about some of these topics. One that I'm sure you know well is I have blue eyes because my mom has blue eyes, and girls get their traits from their mothers and boys get their traits from their fathers. Excellent explanation of the available evidence in somebody's particular family, right? We worked a lot with Deanna Kuhn's research in our thinking about scientific reasoning for early adolescence. I'm sure many of you know her work better than I do. But Deanna writes really beautifully, I think, in some cases, about early adolescence being a time when kids are really blossoming into a capacity to look consciously at their own abstract thinking, to be able to identify evidence in front of them, and to draw comparisons and reflect on the relationship between their own conceptual construct and what they see in a body of evidence. That's a really difficult thing to do on your own, certainly, and to do systematically. But it's a set of capacities that, while in some conditions, we can see kids do those things at much younger ages, middle grades is when kids really begin to flourish in their capacity to do that, if they're supported in doing that. So those were things that we wanted to try to support. Circling back to the issues about digital games, because we thought that some of the affordances of games were really a good fit to this, particularly this idea that, I'll back up a step, that if you think about, and again using a very simple model, but that what you need to begin to understand a new concept you're being introduced to is something to draw on that's consistent with what's being explained to you. The conflict, I'm getting myself in a little bit of a knot here, but typically when we instruct kids with a new concept that doesn't fit their prior understanding, it's very easy to dismiss it, right? We don't pick up the new evidence. And Mickey Chee's work, I guess I should mention, is somebody that we've also drawn on a lot. And what she and Jim Slaughter did a lot of work about was arguing that what kids really need is a category that doesn't exist. And if you can create that category for them, sort of bucket to put an idea in, that then when you introduce some new concept, they've got a bucket to put it in, right? And so electricity is one that they did a lot of work with. The idea of something that behaves like a liquid but is not a liquid is not a category we have. So if you tell me something about electricity and you're using the words you use to talk about a liquid, I'm going to decide it's a liquid, consciously or not. I'm going to say, well, I guess it's a liquid. And that means that when I squeeze a wire, I stop the electricity, and I'm going to draw a bunch of incorrect inferences about that. But if we create a category of things that behave in these ways but are not a material substance, then when you tell me about electricity, I can say, oh, well, maybe electricity fits in this category that I have. That's what we wanted to really try to do with games, was to help kids have really fantastical experiences that were not grounded in the real world, that did not have sort of curricular names attached to them. They were not games about electricity, games about photosynthesis, which was another one we worked on, but that allowed kids to interact with a phenomenon that they were willing to accept in this, crackpot universe we created for a given game, and that was a shared experience that would then support them making sense of new material that they were being having explained to them in class. So we sort of started building this into an instructional framework and thinking about how we wanted to fit the games into some kind of a sequence. So we made the gameplay into homework, and this accomplished a couple of things. It supported the idea of keeping the gameplay out of classroom time, out of the classroom, out of the teacher having to manage it. So we spent a lot of time giving kids DS machines and letting them take them home. It protects the game as play, that this was something that kids were doing outside of the classroom, not in a computer lab. You can play on a bus, you can play with your friends, you can teach your little sister how to do it. They often took them home over the weekend. And so it protected that idea of that this was play. It also gave the kids a shared prior experience. And here we are drawing a lot on Dan Schwartz's work on preparation for future learning, where he and his students have done a lot of different kinds of experiments looking at how prior experiences that provide kids with a common point of reference for later, even quite direct traditional instruction, can help them comprehend that instruction a lot better. So kids were playing these games prior to instruction, so they didn't know the content already, and the game did not introduce them to the content. And in my colleague Cornelia, her phrase that was repeated over and over and over again was, the games don't teach, our games don't teach. They provide a common base for reasoning. Prior to instruction, I just like putting this up. This actually, I think, is a good slide when I talk more to sort of game design people, because they kind of forget how many different kinds of materials teachers have access to and draw on, and how carefully teachers often think about the kinds of materials they want to engage students with at what points in their instructional process. And that, I think broadly, we would do well in digital games for learning in that whole community to be thinking much more carefully about how games might dovetail with other kinds of material experiences, and engagement with different kinds of materials and different configurations of fellow students that kids might have. So the gameplay plays this particular role at the beginning of instruction, and the teachers might go on to use any number of other resources during the rest of their instruction. And the other piece was really that, and some of you probably sort of anticipating this and thinking about it, that the gameplay really becomes the grounding for a shared analogy. That analogical reasoning from this invented bucket, to go back to Mickey Chee's idea, that if you've invented a category of interaction, a kind of behavior, a kind of phenomenon that kids have become familiar with in a digital game, then you can begin to build an analogical relationship between that and the target concept. So I'll show you a couple examples in the games in a minute. But this was something that the more we thought about it, it's really very consistent with, for example, early childhood education. This is why kids play with water tables. This is why we have blocks. It's why we play with sand tables. Gives kids a felt experience, and an experience that's repeated over and over. Kids spend a lot of time at that water table. In our games, the target mechanics, the things kids actually do in the game that are really the core of the game from our instructional perspective, are things they have to do over and over again. And Keith Holyoke talks about this, that when you want to support analogical reasoning, that analogy can't be sort of a superficial one that's made to you for one shot for it to really be powerful. What you want is an analogy that really becomes sort of a really felt and something that's really deeply familiar to you as a tool for reasoning. So in the same way that kids are going to play with blocks sort of throughout their nursery school career and get that felt sense of, well, how tall is a tower before it starts to tip and fall down? And that those are felt experiences that you then are going to be tapping into throughout their sort of early year science education. That was the kind of role we wanted these digital games to play as a shared experience. This is also something, of course, that I think we sometimes almost, romanticize about expert scientists. The image of, scientists drawing insights, by drawing analogies that maybe haven't been made previously. And I don't think there's any reason we shouldn't be encouraging middle school kids to be doing the same kind of analogical connection. Yeah. So this is the instructional sequence we ended up with, and this goes 1, 2, 3, 4. The students play the game as homework. Then the teacher does the regular instruction. We did not try to control the regular instruction, and again, this had to do with our priority being creating a resource that was going to have the potential to gain some traction with teachers and not be yet another curricular choice where either you do this or you do that, and where we're trying to maintain a lot of control over what happens in the classroom. The teachers draw some explicit connections between the game and the target concepts through other activities and drawing out similarities. And then we also developed a transfer activity, which I'm not really going to try to talk about today, but there was a place for teachers that really was an assessment opportunity and a sort of consolidation opportunity for the kids to draw on what they had learned about those topics. So that was sort of the task we set up for ourselves. Excuse me. We made 4 what we called modules. A module was excuse me. A module was the digital game, a set of support materials for teachers that were additional activities and a certain amount of sort of content presentation material that they could pick and choose from and use to support their own instruction and to support them making those connections between the game and the rest of their teaching, and then a transfer activity. And I'm not going to go out to the website right now, but the URL at the end has all the materials for all the modules are there and available, so if you want to take a look at them later, you're very welcome to. So those were our 4 topics, and I'll talk about them super briefly when we look at the games in a minute. And the research that we did, this is, this slide is like 5 years of my life right there. We're really sort of 3 big phases of work, and the first was formative research. A lot of folks at CCT, and sort of where we come from historically, are people who were around in the early days of Sesame Workshop. And so the traditions of formative research that really drove a lot of the development of the early days of Sesame and Electric Company. I think a lot of you are not old enough to be Electric Company people, but those were traditions that Cornelia, again, my colleague that I mentioned before, she was one of the people that came up with Electric Company. So we worked with her and really developed those, sort of cohort of folks that had those skills to go out. And that work is really all about appeal and about comprehensibility. So taking out early versions of materials, checking them out with kids. Less so somewhat with teachers, but primarily this was about the games themselves and checking out, the look and feel of the games, but really more importantly, the mechanics in the games, because the mechanic is really the critical, what you do in the game is a piece that you really internalize. Trying to find out if those mechanics really made sense to the kids in the ways that we intended them to. There's a long, messy story to tell about each of the 4 games. I can tell you those later if you want. Because, as always, it's tricky. You think you've got a clear story. You think that the actions you're giving kids to do in the games mean what you think they mean, and the kids think they mean something entirely different. So that was a long process, but always super fascinating. Sitting down and looking through these materials with kids and getting them talking is endlessly interesting to me. Field tests, that was our chance to really focus on the material situation of doing this, the curricular context of doing this. There was a real question. This was 5 years ago now, bringing portable devices into the classroom. This was pre-iPad. And we really didn't know if parents were going to freak out, principals were going to freak out, what are the policy issues going to be, are they all going to end up, getting traded for something else on the bus and we're never going to get them back. The idea of this instructional sequence that we were asking teachers to move through, was that really going to work for the teachers? So each of the 4 modules went through at least one field test. A couple of them we really changed up the support materials significantly and ran a second field test. Those happened with anywhere from 4 to 16 classrooms. Those gave us a lot of just, glimpses, more than glimpses. We spent a lot of time in teachers' classrooms and looking really carefully at how they made sense of this instructional process we gave them and how they fitted into all the other constraints that they were working under. And then this being IES, yes, Drew.
Yeah, were there a set of design principles that were common across these modules?
There were in an instructional design sense. There were not in terms of game genre and the sort of look and feel of the games. The 4 games, to a kid, the 4 games are quite different from each other. Let me just talk for a minute about the relationship between the research team and the development team. So my colleague Greg Chung at UCLA, who worked on the other center, it just insisted we needed to all get t-shirts made that said "Kill the Fun," because his feeling was that this was the job of the instructional designer, was to go to the game designer and tell them all the things they had to do in the game, that the game designer would then say, well, that's not a fun game anymore. And so this, is the struggle that everyone went through. And so in this case, and the reason I didn't talk about it more specifically is because Cornelia was really the instructional designer on these games, and I was running the research. But what our approach was first of all, the instructional design director was really being driven from our shop, right? So her vision for that instructional design came very clearly out of the research perspective. But she put very clear boundaries on what she required, what those requirements were, and gave the game design shop really free rein with everything else surrounding that. So in each of the games, and I can jump ahead and maybe we should talk about one of them. Let me see. Let's talk about the genetics game for a second. So in the genetics game, there were 2 issues that we really wanted to address in the game, because they were of many, but 2 topics that we really thought we had a shot at helping teachers get at more effectively with kids by having them play a game ahead of time. One of those was this really difficult idea of genuine randomness, right? We use the word random in a lot of very loose, sort of loosey-goosey ways, but the idea of something being genuinely random, that you cannot predict the pattern from any one time to the next, is a really, really hard idea for all of us, let alone when we're in 7th grade. And this was a really hard problem to hand to a game designer, because game design is largely about managing the amount of control that the player has in the game. But you always have to have the player have a sense that they have some significant amount of control. And introducing randomness into a game is actually, they were not happy about that. But that was really a critical piece to us, was that we wanted them to have an experience in the game where they were interacting with something that was genuinely random. And having that had to get baked into sort of the storyline and the challenge of that game. The second idea was to have the kids have an experience where they were managing relationships of dominance and recessiveness of traits in a way that allowed them to experience that dominance and recessiveness does not correspond, and I'm looking at you to correct me here if I get this wrong, to strength and weakness. That the dominant allele does not win in every situation. And we also wanted to simply take it out of traditional settings of talking about reproduction, because that's a setting where you're just inviting kids to replicate the ideas that they already have about, where my traits come from my parents, people's sort of preconceptions about how heredity occurs. So, for example, the design principle was that the team would identify those core experiences, that those experiences had to be baked into the core mechanic of the game. So for those of you that don't have not, I am far from a game designer myself, but that haven't hung out with game designers too much. The mechanics of what you do. It's the core practice. So Angry Birds, the core mechanic is throwing bird, right? So each of the games, we really wanted that. We identified what the core ideas were, the buckets in a Mickey Cheese sort of sense, what those core 1 or 2 buckets were that we wanted kids to establish the shared experience of. It had to be baked into the mechanic of the game. It couldn't be something you watched. It couldn't be something that the narrative told you. It had to be something that you did, and it had to be something that you did repeatedly. So once we established what those were, sort of filling in the surround of the genre of the game, the larger narrative of the game, was really left up to the game designers. And we had really great game designers who were really good at that. So what I think it was this game, that Cornelia's favorite quote from a kid the whole 5 years was a kid who was checking it out for us. And he said, oh, I've played this before. And he hadn't played before. But that meant something to us, that this looked like something he might have played before. So that was a very good sign. So those are sort of process principles more than design principles, Drew, but that was sort of the common core across all 4 games. So what we came up with in the case of Robo Riot was this was this sort of near future environment where there were all these service robots that, ice robots brought you cold drinks, and fire robots cooked food, and they had gotten infected with viruses, and there was a whole story of what you had to do to defeat the sick robots or cure the sick robots. But the core of it was really a Pokemon-style game, if any of you are familiar with that world through your kids or anything, in that every robot had a set of traits, which were effectively alleles. We didn't call them that. But so a fire robot actually has a fire and a water allele, I think. And an ice robot has 2 water alleles. So you have a limited number of robots, and the way you get more robots is by recycling your robots. And so recycling stood in for reproduction, which is what you would have in more of a traditional genetic simulation. And the randomness was that every time you hit that recycler, it was random which alleles combined. So if you knew you really needed a water robot and you didn't have a water robot for your next battle, you'd have to go to the recycler, stick in the robots that could get you a water robot, but you'd have to sit there and press that button until you got that water robot. Now, there are only 2 choices, or 3 choices, maybe sometimes. So we knew they weren't going to be sitting there for 1,000 button presses, or they probably wouldn't at least. So it didn't get too out of hand, but that was the solution to this difficult problem of how do you bake a direct experience of randomness into the game. And the dynamic of who beat who, which is the kind of thing you get to know if you play Pokemon for a long time, the sort of network of superiority, a monster that's very weak against, one monster might actually be very strong against another depending on the trait profiles. That applied here as well. There was one, I think it was the sand robot, could beat almost everybody, but the water robot could beat the sand robot. And once you figured that out, it became a horizontal system rather than a hierarchical system. And this was also a game where we saw a lot of kid expertise getting shared, because if you weren't a kid that sort of had a Pokemon kind of language that you had picked up from other games, this game was a little hard to pick up. But there was always somebody in the room that was like, oh, I got this. Totally got it. We just got to figure out, who beats who. And then that knowledge kind of circulated in the classroom. So just real briefly, the other 3 games, Ruby Realm was our first game, our most painful birth. And this was our vampire game, so we figured it's photosynthesis, but the farthest away we can get from photosynthesis is to get them in a cave with vampires who are actually afraid of the sun. So these kids were saving their friend from the vampires in the cave and had this robot that actually ran on photosynthesis. So they had to get him in shafts of sunlight, and the core mechanic we wanted them to get to there was effectively a mini game, a little puzzle you had to do repeatedly to keep the robot running. And in that case, you were taking, I gotta get this right, CO2 and H2O molecules, breaking them apart with beams of sunlight. It was a shooter game, basically. Breaking the molecules apart and putting them together as a glucose molecule. And I can tell you, if we did nothing else in 5 years, we got a lot of kids out there who can build a glucose molecule. You know what it looks like. They don't know it's a glucose molecule necessarily. But those kids, going back to this idea we had for the games, those kids, if they had played this game for a while, and it didn't really matter how long, it didn't matter if they had finished it, we sort of set half an hour as what we expected of the kids, that they had put in half an hour on it, but you don't have to finish the game to finish the value of the game. That those kids had this sort of internalized knowledge of, oh, well, you break these things apart and you put them back together, and that's the glucose he needs to run. He could also actually make tear gas, which he used to scare away the vampires, and sugar cubes, sucrose, which I can't remember what he did with the sugar cubes, but he did something else with the sugar cubes in the game. Then there was Robo Riot. There's our robots. That's the fire guy, the ice guy. So here are their alleles. So an ice robot required 2 ice alleles. A rock robot you could get from 2 rocks or from a rock and sand. So that's what I was talking about a minute ago. The electricity game really focused on the idea of alignment and flow being something that was about alignment rather than movement of mass. And so used the idea of music and aligning, matching up. So although this looks like a circuit, which turned out to be a big design problem we didn't anticipate, it wasn't really intended to be an analogy to circuits. It was intended to be an analogy to the alignment of electrons, which is the conditions that actually allows electrical energy to flow. So that was a game about music. And then the last one was Galactic Loop, which I will admit is the one I know least well, because I was busy doing the impact study when they were building this one. But this is a heat transfer game. I think it's the one that's the least different from other games out there about heat transfer, because the core challenge is, this very simple, very persistent belief, right, that cold flows to warm rather than the other way around. So this was a game where you're trying to keep an egg warm under increasingly difficult conditions. So I'm going to sort of shift from talking about the games themselves and the ideas behind that to what we learned about what this looked like in the classroom and what we found were the cost and benefits for the teachers. Does anybody have any urgent questions about the games themselves? So I can keep going there. How am I doing on time? What do we want to do? I don't know. 15 minutes. Okay, I can do like another 10 or 12 minutes. So how did this work in the classroom? So one thing I was talking about earlier were these infrastructure issues and hardware issues. And just to take 1 second on a soapbox, for those of you that don't think about technology in school issues regularly, this continues to be, a really under-recognized problem. I mean, all the infrastructure school problems of our public schools are an under-recognized issue. But an awful lot of technology investment is going on right now in the ed tech world based on a lot of assumptions about what kids have access to that simply aren't true. You go into rural schools, you go into urban schools, and plenty of suburban schools too. They have slow internet, they don't have internet, they do not necessarily have cell phone access. These kids are not all walking around with their own smartphones. I did testing with the Nintendos in a school where we were using point-to-point, and the teachers were thrilled because they never had kids doing any kind of online collaboration because they didn't have bandwidth in the school building. And the idea that they could do point-to-point, infrared off the Nintendos was just such a better solution than anything they had in their building. So while Nintendos are never going to be the solution for anybody's school, it was really important for this work that we did. We found at least one, the solution that worked for this project, and it was a very real issue. And if we had this project depend on high-speed bandwidth and every kid having their own computer, we would have gotten exactly nowhere. So that was a really important issue. Soapbox over. But using the Nintendos, if you think of it just at the level of kids having their own devices and using portable devices, it worked great. We never, in the schools that obviously we were in fact invited into, we never had parent issues. We didn't run into any policy issues with the administrators. We probably worked with somewhere around 1,600 or 1,800 kids in the course of this project. We lost 9 DSs. And that was with kids taking them home, usually for 2 or 3 days at a time. And my friend always wants me to point out, my colleague does, that 6 of those 9 were in one class, and it was a substitute teacher. So, not to hold that teacher accountable. The teachers were really anxious about this issue, and we really had to, sort of convince them, look, worst case, not a single one comes back. It's not your fault, right? We can handle it. But it really worked incredibly well. And the kids did do the homework. We did keep, we had time codes from the chips. And the kids did, on average, play more than we asked them to. So that piece of it was really effective. In terms of using the overall instructional arcs that we asked the teachers to use, they generally use the materials we asked them to. In the field tests, we really encouraged teachers to adapt and use them in ways that made sense to them, because we wanted to see what those solutions were that the teachers chose to use. In an impact study, which was an experimental trial, obviously we gave them much more structured guidelines. And in that case, I think that's my next slide. So to talk about the impact study for a minute, to talk about this issue of implementation. The teachers basically, did use the materials and use them in the ways that we asked them to. This is self-report. It's 21 teachers, because there were 42 teachers in the whole trial. The place where we did not see the same kind of fidelity we did for the rest of the features of the implementation we were asking them to follow was in the explicitly making links between the science concept, between the content and the game. And this was consistent with something that we saw a lot in the field tests as well, which was the teachers really didn't talk about the games and sort of encourage discussion of the games nearly as much in the classroom as we thought they would. This connected to something we also saw very clearly in the field test and tried to address then in the impact study, which was the teachers don't play the games. Right. So we had tutorials for the teachers. We had them spend time playing them during professional development time. But again, that sense, that repetitiveness, that really putting in the time with the game that the kids did, the teachers didn't have that. So unless you're a teacher who's comfortable having the kind of conversation where you say, well, you guys tell me, fill me in here, you weren't likely to run those kind of conversations unless you were a teacher who was really comfortable doing that. So that connects to some other things I'll talk about in a minute. Another big challenge we found with the teacher's role and the expectations that we brought to this project about how the teacher's instruction and work with the kids would fit with this experience they had with the digital game is really about learning goals. And this is a piece that's, to me, it's almost less about individual teachers and their instructional practice than it is about curriculum and about assessment mandates. And the stories was sort of clearest. It was really an issue with all 4 games, maybe least with the last one. But with our genetics game, kids take the 8th grade science test, and they have to be able to do a Punnett square. So in a lot of classrooms that we brought this game to, nominally coming in and having discussions with us, the teachers were very aware this was a topic that was very hard for them to teach well, that they often didn't move the needle with their kids on some of these underlying ideas about how heredity actually works. But then when you went in and looked in practice at what they were spending time on with their kids, they were preparing their kids for these assessments, right? And that often meant, at least in New York State, teaching kids how to do Punnett squares. And, executing a Punnett square, in my opinion, is a really excellent example of procedural knowledge, right? The fact that you know how to do that Punnett square does not necessarily have any relationship at all to your ability to think about what heredity actually means in a population or in any given real-life instance. One of a moment that we saw that always really sticks with me is, a teacher was working the kids through, brown eyes, blue eyes, Punnett square, and one of the kids raised her hand, and she said, well, how many of you have brown eyes? How many of you have blue eyes? And a girl raised her hand and said, well, I have green eyes. She's in 7th grade, right? It's all about individuality. And it was really important to her, like, I'm a green-eyed person. That's like a thing about me, right? And the teacher said, all right, for today, everybody has either brown eyes or blue eyes. And that was, that's one of those times where you're taking the complexity that the kids are really interested in. Heredity is interesting, like something's at stake here for me, right? And rather than being in a position where you're able to really follow up on that and build on that, and take that as an opportunity to really think about how heredity works, instead you're pulling them back because there's really just a procedure that you need to move them through. And from the teacher's perspective, that's an absolutely legitimate mandate that they are responsible to. So that's a very black and white instance. There were some more nuanced ones with electricity, just briefly with the electricity game, where we were really focused on this idea of alignment, of really grappling with, well, what is electricity? Which I continue to struggle with, and you should too. If any of you really have this down, let me know. Rather than struggling with that, mostly what the teachers were doing was teaching circuits. And you can teach kids how to build a circuit very effectively without ever really grappling with what energy actually is. And it was interesting that we have some really nice examples of ways that the teachers and the kids too actually sort of reinterpreted what was going on in the game to make it fit what they were understanding about how circuits worked, which was removed from understanding how electricity actually works. So there was a whole set of issues there that had to do with curricular context. We did find, though, those were really pretty loud and clear issues and pretty significant hurdles. There was a more nuanced issue that took us a while to really pick up on, but that we started to really look at more systematically, which is when teachers did talk about the games, which was not a lot. I mean, if you've got pages of transcripts, you're grabbing out these, few examples. But when they did, the kinds of questions they asked the kids and the kinds of conversations that started to happen were really qualitatively different from most of the question and answer that was going on. So, your sort of routine, direct closed question, answer, reinforcement cycle that, we see over and over again in classrooms, that really actually did start to get broken up when the teachers were talking about the games. Because there really was, there's work to be done to try to make sense of, well, how does this game relate to this topic? This is a game and this is a question we always ask kids when we talk to them about the games. This game's supposed to be about photosynthesis. How could this game be about photosynthesis, right? It doesn't say photosynthesis, it doesn't say glucose. And getting the kids to reason through, well, what do I know about photosynthesis and what do I know about this game? And how do they relate is the place where you can start to really do some sense making. So this is a little bit of a cheat, but I really love this quote. So it's a cheat because they were not talking about the game at the time, they were talking about that transfer activity that I mentioned. And this was a kid who had to, answering a given question in the process of this activity rested on whether or not electricity counted as a substance. And he was sort of muttering to himself and was sort of in this cycle of trying to think what a substance was. So he starts building an analogy. Well, if I'm swimming in water, how is that like electricity moving through the water? And his teacher says you're starting to reason like a scientist, just walking by, checking in on the groups. That was his reinforcement to the kid. And what I love about the fact that the teacher did that is that at this point in the process, the kid's wrong, right? He does not have it figured out yet, but the teacher recognized, and this is a teacher that was just a real pleasure to work with, the teacher recognized that the kid was doing the kind of back and forth reasoning that we were trying to encourage. So to me, that was a very on point thing for the teacher to say to that kid. So this figure is not going to make any sense for a minute, but it, to me, it really synthesizes a lot of what we found in the course of this project about the role of teachers in making this particular kind of digital game that we created effective for kids. So I sort of jumped over earlier, but we did conduct an experimental trial. We worked with 42 teachers in 35 or 37 schools, just with the photosynthesis unit. Did a pretty traditional photosynthesis assessment, which I think was a weakness of what we did. It was also, I was saying to Carol earlier, it was a very diverse group of teachers in terms of the school context they were working with and the curricula they were working with. So it was a challenging sample in a sense. It wasn't a neat, clean, homogeneous group. But something we really wanted to get out of this trial was to, I didn't want to go through all the work of making an experiment happen and end up with that, that one impact outcome. I wanted to try to bake some other opportunities to learn something into this. So we built into the design of the study that we were going to look at the quality of the teacher's instruction as a potential moderator of the impact on kids. And the short version of the story is we did not have a significant outcome in the impact study. We didn't see a big difference in outcomes on photosynthesis assessment between the kids whose teachers were using the Possible Worlds materials and the other kids. But when you put so the way we talked about quality of instruction was we used the class S. And I think from Drew, some of you may know the class, which comes out of Vanderbilt. Teachstone is a sort of spin-off that supports it. We were all trained on the class secondary, which had just come out that year. I think it's a fabulous instrument. I'd be interested to talk to any of you that have used it or are familiar with it. But it's an observational instrument to sort of structure observations of teachers and to sort of score the quality of, it's classroom management, the quality of the social environment, the quality of the sort of discourse and instructional activity that are going on in the room. And when we put those class scores in as a moderating factor in the model, what you find is, so this x-axis is the class scores, and class scores run from 1 to 7. So further out on the x-axis is a teacher who scored according to the class as a teacher with a higher level of instructional quality. And the y-axis is we randomized to teachers. So these are class aggregated scores on the assessment we gave kids. The red line is the control teachers. The blue line is the treatment teachers. So while overall those, looking just at outcomes, those lines were not significantly different from each other. Well, not those lines, but the kids' assessment scores were not significantly different from each other. But when you put in the class, this was not quite significant, but it was a really strong trend. So we decided in the article we published on the study, we did include it in there because we felt it was strong enough, even though it wasn't officially significant. The kids who were in the classrooms that used Possible Worlds and had teachers who we scored as having a high instructional quality actually outscored the control kids. And the lower instructional quality teachers underperformed the control kids. Quality of instruction didn't have a lot of influence in the control classroom, which is kind of surprising because we know that's a factor that's always driving quality of kids' outcomes in many ways. Maybe it's because it is such a difficult topic. All of these are very difficult topics to teach effectively. But in this case, the quality of the instruction seems to really have a driving role in the teacher's the teacher's ability to make effective use of these materials. So, I have mixed feelings about this as a finding in terms of our particular project. I think our goal was to create resources that would not be burdensome for the teacher, keeping the game out of instruction, having it be something that's supplemental to what they're doing anyway. Turns out even under those conditions, you're really relying a lot on the teacher's capacity to really support the kind of sense-making, and in our case particularly analogical thinking, that we were trying to support. And so, in a sense, that's discouraging because this is something that at the end of the day, we're all relying on. We create our interventions, we come up with these ideas for curricula, and at the end of the day, if we haven't adequately supported the teachers in thinking about how to do this well in the moment in the classroom, and all the complexity that they're dealing with, it can be all for naught. So I think it's important. I'm glad we got this out of the data. I'm glad we did the work to use the class. I think in the digital games for learning world, this is a really important lesson to be pushing on. I think we tend to have a lot of assumptions that what kids learn in a game is somehow then baked into them, and they sort of march out into the universe with that knowledge. I'm not sure that's the case. I think like in any other environment, it's that sense-making of the experience that is really what's going to help kids recognize and master and hold on to that knowledge. And that's really where I want to end, that I think, you know, in a sense where we started, and but I think we understand in a much deeper way about digital games now, is that they are, in the context of science learning, more like than different than all the other kinds of experiences you might invite kids to have to make sense of the world around them, whether it's young kids with plants, older kids doing more formal experiments. That experience in and of itself is not the thing that's going to get the kids to the formalized knowledge that we still, those digital games need the sense-making surround and the guidance of well-qualified teachers as much as anything else. And I think I talked a little too long, so I apologize. But that is where I stop. This website has all the games and all the resources. There is an overview video that's a little bit out of date, but that you can find on YouTube. And I really want to know any feedback or questions anybody has. Yes?
By looking at the 4 games, the vampire game and the different kinds of games, they felt like casual games. The simple games that you can play for 10 minutes at a time, blah, blah, blah. And I was wondering during your studies in the classroom what you saw as far as gender was concerned. Great question. Absolutely. And gender is something that historically our group's been very concerned with and has driven a lot of things that we've done around design and development. They were casual in that they're really easy entry and you can play them for 10 minutes. They all have a lot of levels and get a lot harder later on. So kids that want to grind on a game and want to sort of play through, they had pretty ambitious narratives, and you could get to the end and defeat the boss, and they got pretty tricky in the end levels. So in that sense, they were sort of full blown, but yeah, more within the casual games world than in some huge domain. What we found on the one simple answer is in the time played. We actually tended to see girls playing a little bit more than the boys. My interpretation of that is, girls maybe being more compliant with homework than the boys are. We made a lot of choices in the design of the games and the kinds of characters we put in, the kinds of mechanics to make sure they weren't sort of fitting into kind of, some obvious stereotypes that would really reinforce games as for boys. I also think, in general, the population has shifted, that a lot of girls are playing games now. There's certainly games they don't play so much. But, like you said, in the casual games world, I think that bar is a lot lower, as long as you're not asking for, like, big commitment. You've got to be expert. The games didn't invite that kind of competitiveness. Yes?
You said there was no difference in the 2 groups, control and treatment, in terms of no significant difference in terms of student outcome. What was your outcome measure?
Our outcome measure was a pretty traditional multiple choice assessment. We put it together. We had used it in field tests and revised it based on that. So we sort of, and I'm not an assessment expert by any stretch. So it was, I think we were pretty confident in its. The coherence of it as an assessment, and it was focused on both sort of content knowledge about photosynthesis and the chemical change principles underlying photosynthesis, as well as obviously the sort of core misconception issue, which is this idea that plant matter doesn't come from matter, that it doesn't come from dirt, it comes from water vapor and gases, right? I think it would have been much more interesting if we had tried some other assessment strategies as well. We did do some interview studies afterwards and didn't see a whole lot of robust understanding from any of the kids, frankly, across the control and the treatment groups either, although that was a little while after. I think doing some more innovative assessment would have been really interesting. We partly didn't partly because we're not a really strong assessment shop. It's not sort of where our expertise lies. Partly because we wanted it to feel really manageable for the teachers and have it fit with their expectations and what they wanted to assess the kids on. So it was kind of both. But I think there are a lot of other things we could have done that would have given us more insight. Yes?
You mentioned that you had data on the number of hours of the games, like from the cards, you could see the usage.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any way to look at, specifically in the games, achievement and comprehension of the game? I mean, you can play that game for 6 hours, but if you don't get it, that doesn't mean you've gotten any better at it. You know, is there a way to look at a person's ability to increase their knowledge of the concepts while playing?
We didn't. And that was intentional, although in some ways I wish we had done it differently. But the choice behind not doing it was that the design of the games was intended so that as long as you played for, the benchmark we picked was about half an hour, which we didn't pick very scientifically. If you got that mechanic down, you got what you needed to get from the game.
Okay.
That it was, again, it was this ground for the analogy. So, memorizing, in the case of the photosynthesis game, memorizing glucose as opposed to tear gas doesn't really matter. It's the idea that you're breaking apart, putting back together, and that the sunlight's doing the breaking apart, that the molecules you're beginning from are water, are gas and liquid, and that you're creating solid. As long as you got that idea, so it's sort of like Angry Birds, as long as you got the feel of that swipe, the finer points of which kind of tower takes which kind of strategy, it's fun within the game, but it's not actually relevant to the instructional sort of gas that the game's intended to provide. It's a tricky. Cornelia had to convince us of that over and over and over again.
I just want to take a moment for all of us to thank Katie for a great talk and let people who need to sneak out do that. But we will be staying around, so if you have further questions, please send one out. Please feel free to do so.